start with the Supreme Court's ruling that most of the Trump tariff administration's emergency tariffs were unlawful. What does this mean for US trade policy and global economic ties?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. So first, I'll say that the decision is in some ways monumental because this is a cornerstone of President Trump's economic policies. He loves tariffs. He loves the revenue generating aspect of these tariffs. And much of the tariffs have now been struck down. So this goes on many different countries, many different rates, and much of it is now sort of gone. So in that sense, it was a huge decision. And in another sense, it's not clear that it's going to have huge economic effects. President Trump has threatened to reimpose tariffs using other laws, and these are laws that he has used in the past to put tariffs in place. National security-based tariffs. Many of the tariffs from President Trump's first term were done under laws that were never challenged at the court, and so there's just a lot of there was a lot of uncertainty last year about the effects of the tariffs. I would say there's going to continue to be a lot of uncertainty going forward about exactly where these tariffs are going to land. So
you don't necessarily think that there will be, particularly strong economic effects following the potential loss of tariff revenue and, the possible refunds to businesses that are expected potentially if they get stuck in the High Court or not?
Yeah, so, that's certainly an issue that Congress and, the administration need to sort of figure out. In principle, it should not be that difficult to refund tariffs that have been paid. Most of these tariffs are paid electronically already, but I have a feeling that the administration doesn't want to make it easy to make these refunds back. They're going to, try to delay or argue that they shouldn't have to.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of companies have already had dealt with the fact that they're dealing with, they're coming to accept the fact that these tariffs are higher. They increased their inventories by a lot last year, and they're sort of trying to plan for the future. And now we just have another uncertainty shock for these companies to deal with. Are the tariffs going to come back to where they were before? What types of things might be coming forward? Are companies going to be affected by these new tariff applications that President Trump is saying he's going to do? Just a lot of uncertainty going forward, I would say.
More broadly speaking, the US economy expanded at a fairly moderate pace in 2025 overall, but growth slowed significantly at the end of the year. What factors are driving this slowdown and how might they influence prospects for 2026?
Yeah, so of course, the longest government shutdown in history is a big contributor to the individual fourth quarter growth number. You had workers, government workers who were not getting paid and not spending, right? And so this was definitely a drag on economic growth. And that's why, you mentioned that growth in 2025 as a whole was, pretty strong, pretty comparable to the year before. And that's why we tend to look economists tend to look through these individual quarterly numbers if we're trying to get a sense of the health of the economy. The other thing, of course, that we should expect is some sort of bounce back in the first quarter as a result of this kind of what's hopefully a temporary shock coming from the government shutdown. That's definitely the biggest factor that was responsible for this fairly low growth number in the fourth quarter.
And inflation has been persistent by some measures, and the job market shows mixed signals. First, are American households feeling financially secure or starting to feel that pressure? How might these conditions likely to shape monetary policy and consumer confidence?
Yeah, so consumers are not happy. They are, you're right that inflation has been elevated. So, the Fed's target of 2% inflation per year, there's been a couple of years now where they've been above target. And if you listen to many of the officials at the Federal Reserve, they say that they want to see more evidence that prices are coming down before they even consider, lowering interest rates further or things like this. And, that's not what the president wants. The president wants interest rates to be as low as they can be, as fast as they can be. But the Federal Reserve has been very cautious about signaling that they're not going to reduce rates until they see some progress, inflation coming down.
Yeah.
And I think what's very interesting, of course, is that, consumers, the typical consumer, the way the typical consumer thinks of inflation is, well, prices are higher than they were before. And I'm not going to be happy until prices are back where they were. I want
Of
prices to be
course.
lower again. But that's not really how economists think about inflation at all. Economists think about inflation as 2% growth in prices. There's some growth in prices that happens every year. And the prospect of prices going back down to where they were last year, that would be deflation, and that is certainly
Yeah.
doesn't seem in the cards. So,
So
but you're
Trump,
right that consumer confidence
yeah.
and nervousness about prices is certainly a defining feature of this economy right now.
And so then that brings me to Trump giving his State of the Union address next week. I'm sure he's going to focus a little, at least, on affordability. What do you think that message will be, and how should we expect the road ahead in the US in terms of the economy?
It's interesting because the President Trump's economic advisors have been begging him to focus on the issue of affordability, asking him to say that he feels it's a concern, that he's listening to Americans, and it's just very hard for him to do that. He's constantly distracted. He thinks affordability is a made-up issue. He thinks that people are just using it as a cudgel against his administration. But if you look at the consumer confidence data, you look at the consumer sentiment, people are upset about inflation. And his signature policy, his signature economic policy of higher tariffs, is not a policy that's going to lead to lower prices. By design, putting tariffs in place, whether they're the IEEPA tariffs that were just thrown out in the Supreme Court, or any of the other tariffs that he's put in place that are totally unaffected by the Supreme Court ruling, those are things that are going to raise prices rather than lowering prices.
All
And
right.
President Trump has doubled down on that policy among all others as his signature economic policy. So there may be, occasional, you might look for in the speech an occasional policy here, an occasional policy there. Oh, let me put a 10% limit on credit card interest, things like this. But small potatoes compared to the kind of
Yeah.
things that consumers want to see, or dismantling his tariff regime.